The day my parents decided I was no longer their daughter, the sky hung low and purple, heavy with a storm that wouldn't break. I was 18, standing on the cracked concrete stoop of the only home I'd ever known, with nothing but a backpack full of drugstore makeup, 2 changes of clothes, and a wallet that held $43. My mother stood behind the screen door, her arms folded so tightly across her chest that her knuckles went white. My father wouldn't even come to the door. I could see the back of his head in the living room, fixed on the television, as if I were already invisible. "You've got a job," my mother said. Her voice didn't waver. "You're an adult now. We've done our part. The rest is on you." I tried to say something, but my throat was full of broken glass. I had graduated high school 2 days earlier. I'd been working the evening shift at a grocery store, bagging groceries for minimum wage, saving every penny for a beat-up car so I could commute to community college in the fall. They knew that. They just didn't care. My older brother, Marcus, had been given a bedroom until he was 24, his meals cooked, his laundry folded. But I was the girl who'd talked back once too often, who'd asked why the rules were different, who'd refused to hand over my paychecks for household expenses that always seemed to buy my father new fishing gear. I was the daughter who made them feel guilty simply by existing, and they'd finally found a reason to scrape me off like something stuck to the bottom of a shoe. The screen door latched with a soft click. I stood there for what felt like an hour, the weight of my own heartbeat shaking my ribs. Then I walked, my sneakers slapping the wet pavement, heading toward the bus station with no idea that I was taking the first steps into a life that would, eventually, become something beautiful. The first year nearly broke me. I slept in a shelter for 3 weeks, curled on a cot in a room that smelled of bleach and hopelessness, clutching my backpack like a lifeline. I showered at a truck stop, washing my hair with soap from the dispenser, drying it under the hand dryer. I got a second job at a diner, working the breakfast rush from 5 until noon, then running to the grocery store for the afternoon shift. I ate day-old muffins the diner would have thrown out anyway, and I kept a notebook where I wrote down everything I spent, down to the penny. I cried in bathroom stalls so no one would see. And slowly, painfully, I learned that survival wasn't about strength, it was about refusing to stop moving. I found a room for rent in a basement, with a tiny window that looked out at a concrete wall and a family of mice that lived in the ceiling. The landlady, an elderly widow named Mrs. Calloway, let me pay week to week as long as I didn't make noise after 10. I didn't. I was too exhausted to make noise. I used the library computers to study for my GED. I'd missed the chance to enroll in college that fall, but I promised myself I wouldn't miss it forever. I took every extra shift, taught myself to cook real food on a single hot plate, and learned to smile at customers even when my feet bled and my back ached. It took 3 years, but I enrolled in community college. A scholarship for non-traditional students covered most of the tuition, the rest I paid by working catering gigs on weekends. That's where I discovered I had a gift. I could walk into a chaotic kitchen and see the calm at the center of the storm. I could build a menu around a budget so tight it squeaked. I could coax tired ingredients into something elegant, something that made people pause mid-bite and ask who was in the kitchen. I started small, birthday parties, office lunches, cooking out of a rented commercial kitchen at midnight when the rates were lowest. I called my tiny operation Sage and Thyme, because those were the herbs that grew in Mrs. Calloway's garden, the first fresh things I'd been allowed to pick and use in years. It grew, the way things grow when you water them with every spare ounce of your soul. I met Daniel at an anniversary party I catered. He was the one who tipped me $100 on a $70 bill and left a note on a napkin that said, "This food made me feel something. I'd like to feel it again." He wasn't asking for a date, he was asking for my next event's details. He showed up at a charity luncheon I'd done for a women's shelter, a detail I only learned later, and he stayed to help me pack down the folding tables without being asked. He had kind, steady hands and a laugh that sounded like a door opening. We married 2 years later, in Mrs. Calloway's backyard, with fairy lights strung between the tomato cages. She cried. I cried harder. By the time I was 32, I had everything I'd ever dared to whisper to the universe in those dark, hungry years. A modest but gorgeous craftsman house with a wraparound porch and a kitchen that got morning light. A thriving catering company that had grown into a small café downtown, its exposed brick walls covered in local art. A daughter, Lily, who had Daniel's curls and my stubborn chin, who was 5 years old and believed the garden fairies moved the peonies at night. And, buried so deep I almost forgot it was there, the scar tissue of a past I never spoke about. My parents' names never crossed my lips. As far as my life was concerned, I had been born the day Mrs. Calloway handed me that basement key. Until the afternoon they showed up at my gate. I was on my knees in the front garden, dirt caked under my nails, showing Lily how to wiggle a worm back into the soil, when I heard the latch. I looked up and the world tilted. They were older, of course. My father's shoulders had folded inward, his hair gone the color of cigarette ash. My mother had the same hard set to her mouth, but her skin hung loose at the jaw, and she walked with a slight hitch, a cane I didn't remember. They stood at the edge of my peony bed like two crows who'd been circling something dead. For a long, ringing moment, no one spoke. Elena. My mother's voice. That voice. It pulled something tight in my chest, a muscle I'd long believed was dead. I stood slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans. I made sure Lily was behind me. What are you doing here? My father looked around the garden, the blooming hydrangeas, the painted porch, the glint of my car in the driveway. He let out a low whistle. Looks like you did all right for yourself. After you abandoned us. The audacity hit me like a physical blow. I felt my pulse in my temples. I didn't abandon anyone. You kicked me out. I was 18. I had $43. My mother waved a hand, as if brushing away a fly. That was years ago. Water under the bridge. We're your parents. We're getting older, Elena. The house is in foreclosure. Your father's health isn't what it was. We don't have anywhere else to go. It was so perfectly, monstrously simple. They hadn't come to apologize. They hadn't come to make amends. They'd come because they'd run out of other options, because they'd heard through some distant relative that I'd built something, and in their minds, whatever I'd built belonged to them. You can't stay here, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Daniel had come to the front door, drawn by the strangeness of voices, and I saw him step onto the porch, his face shifting from curiosity to cold recognition. I'd told him everything, years ago, in the dark of our bedroom, his arms wrapped around me while I shook apart. My mother's expression hardened. We'll see about that. You have a duty to your family. We raised you. Everything you have is because of us. The law says children have to support their parents who can't support themselves. We've already spoken to someone. She said it with a smug little tilt of her chin, and for a moment, I was 18 again, standing on that stoop, powerless and small. But I wasn't small anymore. The girl who'd slept in a shelter, who'd worked until her hands bled, who'd built a business from a single burner and a dream, she was still in there, and she was furious. You need to leave, I said. Now. They didn't argue much then. They just smiled, that thin, knowing smile that said they believed they'd already won. My father patted the gatepost like he was measuring it for something. We'll be in touch, he said, and they walked away, slow and entitled, leaving the air behind them sour. The letter came a week later. Certified mail. A legal notice informing me that my parents, Albert and Cynthia Vance, were filing a petition for parental support under the state's filial responsibility statute. They were claiming indigence, inability to work, and abandonment. They were requesting a court order that I provide housing, monthly financial support, and access to my assets for their care. The amount they listed, based on some formula involving my tax records and property value, was staggering. It would have stripped us of our savings, pulled Lily's college fund down to zero, and forced me to either take them into my home or pay for an equivalent residence. They were trying to take everything. My home. My business. My daughter's future. All of it. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt that old, familiar terror, the child inside me who believed she deserved nothing, who was always one mistake away from the street. Daniel took the letter, read it, and set it down with a gentleness that made me want to scream. "They can't do this," he said. "We'll fight." And we did. The next weeks were a blur of attorney consultations, document gathering, and sleepless nights. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya who had a reputation for dismantling bullies, told me that filial responsibility laws existed in our state but were rarely enforced unless there was clear evidence of the child's ability to pay and the parent's genuine need. But she also said that the emotional element, the claim that I had abandoned them, could sway a judge if I didn't have proof of what really happened. Proof. I had no proof. Just my memories, and the bones they were carved into. Then I remembered Mrs. Calloway. She had passed away 5 years ago, leaving me her garden journals and a small box of things she'd kept from my time in her basement. I'd never opened the box, it was too painful. I drove to the storage unit that evening, lifted the lid with trembling fingers, and found a miracle. Inside was a letter I'd written to myself in that first year, a desperate, scribbled thing on diner stationery, detailing everything, the date I was kicked out, the words my mother said, the fact that I had $43 and no car, the address of the shelter where I'd stayed. I'd written it as a form of survival, a way to remind myself that if I ever made it out, I would never let anyone treat me that way again. There were also copies of my pay stubs from the grocery store, dated the week after my eviction, and a journal entry where I recorded trying to call home once and having my father hang up on me. But the real weapon was a small, faded envelope addressed to me at the shelter. It was from my brother, Marcus. He'd written me a week after I was thrown out, full of guilt and apology. He confirmed that our parents had planned it for months, that they'd been waiting until I turned 18 to cut their losses. He wrote that he was sorry he couldn't stop them, that he was saving to move out himself. The letter was dated, stamped, and unmistakably in his handwriting. It was a confession, locked in time. My lawyer smiled when she saw it. It was the first time I'd seen her smile since this began. The court date arrived on a Tuesday in October, the air crisp and smelling of fallen leaves. My parents shuffled in, my mother leaning on her cane, my father wearing a suit jacket that didn't fit. They played the part of frail, abandoned elders beautifully. My mother dabbed at her eyes. My father spoke of how they'd sacrificed everything for me, how I'd turned my back on them the moment I found success. He called me ungrateful, selfish, a daughter who forgot where she came from. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the stand with my back straight and my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the judge, a woman about my age, with sharp eyes and a steady gaze, and I told her the truth. I told her about the stoop and the $43. About the shelter and the hunger. About working 2 jobs and crying in bathrooms. I told her about the mice in the ceiling and Mrs. Calloway and the day I decided I would either die trying or I would build something that no one could ever take from me. Then Priya submitted the evidence. The letter from Marcus. The pay stubs. The shelter documentation. My own desperate, handwritten testament. The courtroom went very quiet. My parents' lawyer objected, but it was half-hearted. The narrative they'd built, the poor, abandoned parents, crumbled under the weight of what was in that box. I watched my mother's face turn the color of old putty. My father wouldn't look at me. The judge didn't take long. She spoke carefully, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that was, in her words, morally unambiguous. She found that while the filial responsibility law had merit in cases of genuine need and genuine relationship, the evidence showed a willful severance of parental duties when I was a vulnerable teenager. She stated that my parents had forfeited any equitable claim to my support when they rendered me homeless with deliberate intent. The petition was denied with prejudice. They would get nothing, not a single dollar, not a night in my home, not a piece of the life I'd built with my own scarred hands. I didn't cry, not there. I just nodded, thanked the judge, and walked out into the sharp autumn air. Daniel was waiting on the courthouse steps, and he wrapped me in his arms without a word. I let myself breathe for what felt like the first time in months. My parents emerged a few minutes later. My mother's cane clicked on the stone. She looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw something underneath the hardness, a flicker of the mother I'd yearned for when I was small, the one who'd brushed my hair before school and sung off-key in the kitchen. But she was a ghost in a stranger's body. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and I realized I didn't want to hear whatever poison or plea she had left. I held up my hand. Don't. We're done. Forever. She flinched. My father tugged her arm, his face a mask of sullen defeat. They turned and walked toward a bus stop, growing smaller and smaller until they were just shapes disappearing into the city I'd survived without them. I didn't watch them go. I didn't need to. That evening, I stood in my garden, the last light fading over the peonies. Lily ran barefoot through the grass, chasing fireflies with a mason jar, her laughter stitching the air into something whole. Daniel was inside, making hot chocolate, the kitchen windows glowing gold. I knelt in the dirt again, pressing my palms flat against the earth, feeling the cool, steady heartbeat of the ground that held me up. For so long, I had believed that everything I built was fragile, that the family who made me could unmake me at any moment. But standing there, with soil under my nails and the scent of thyme drifting from the herb beds, I realized the truth: they could never take what was never theirs. My life, my home, my heart, these things were grown from my own roots, watered with my own tears, and they belonged only to me and to the people I chose to love. I had nothing once. Now I had everything. And no one, not even blood, could lay claim to a garden they had tried to salt and burn. Check my profile for the full story.